I wanted to move on to the technocracy aspect. So you've written about in Techno Tyranny, I think, your article about the U.S.-China AI war and how the U.S. This is an interesting point that you bring up, how the U.S. is using China as an excuse to kind of bring the Chinese system to America, saying that if we don't test and deploy that technocracy that they have in China, that China will advance and eventually take over the world, which, I mean, there may be some truth to that, but I don't think that's a pretext to take away our civil liberties. This is also something that Kai-Fu Lee writes about in AI Superpowers, which is a really good book I recommend. I've talked on the podcast about the Chinification of the West for years, and it's happening now. And you've pointed out recently how technocrats are now being put in charge of remaking our societies. It was just reported that Bill Gates and ex-Google head Eric Schmidt will be in charge of remaking the health and education systems in New York. These are two men with backgrounds in technology, and they will be directing systems to deal with health and education. And on top of that, you recently tweeted about the DoD discussing the termination of legacy systems and introducing these new AI technocratic systems. So what can you tell us about this techno tyranny?
Well, there's definitely a lot there. So basically, the Techno-Tyranny article is about a presentation from May of last year that was developed by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which is headed by Eric Schmidt. And it is also, the vice chair is a close confidant of Eric Schmidt, who is a guy named Robert Work, who is a former Deputy Secretary of Defense. Both Robert Work and Eric Schmidt are very close to Henry Kissinger, which I think is worth pointing out, because Henry Kissinger also advises this group, and it explains there's actually a slide that uses a quote from Kissinger and offers two possible paths for the U.S. to not fall behind in AI and lose its technological advantage over China. The first involves basically surpassing China in the adoption of AI-driven technologies and surveillance and technocracy, going far beyond what China has implemented even now. And doing it here faster and more extensively. The second one is basically the Chinese and American technocrats, the technocratic elite of both countries, working together to create a global federation of tech companies that will write the international rule book on AI. And they say if the U.S. is not part of the discussion or doesn't come to dominate the field and surpass China entirely, that we will not be able to set the international norms on AI, and the U.S. will lose its global hegemony, both militarily and economically. And the purpose of this National Security Commission is to give recommendations to the federal government and Congress about how to prevent the U.S. from losing its hegemony, specifically in technology as it relates to artificial intelligence. It's worth pointing out that, as I said earlier, this was a document that came out last year. This body was created by the 2018 NDAA, and around that same time, the White House was producing all of its policies on artificial intelligence, which have been dramatically undercovered. Some of them include, AI for the American worker and AI for American industry. And, these greatly precede the coronavirus pandemic. And the AI for American worker program, for example, talks about training American workers about how to work more closely with robots and artificial intelligence systems. All very disconcerting when you look at the fact that the coronavirus pandemic has wiped out pretty much all of the obstacles point for point that this National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence document calls legacy systems, and say that these had to be removed so that these AI-driven systems can be widely adopted in the U.S. And these range from things like individual car ownership, seeing an in-person doctor, paying for goods with a cash and a credit card, even going into physically into a store to buy something. All of these things they describe as legacy systems that need to be removed so that all of those existing, ways of life, I guess, methods of purchasing or, seeing a doctor and all of this stuff, that is essentially an obstacle to their replacement by AI systems, and that Americans are distrustful of AI. They see it as a something that is going to take their jobs. This is what the document says, that, the American perception of AI is a problem, that Americans need to come to see AI as a tool. And I think it's very interesting that because of this coronavirus pandemic, we're seeing in mass media a lot of a massive, I would say, a positive PR push about AI and robots and a lot of these technologies. There's numerous articles that say things like AI is our partner or ally in the battle against coronavirus. A lot of these words like ally, battle, friend, partner, all of this stuff about AI helping us now. It's definitely, I would argue, a major effort to change perception, as is the fact that you're seeing a lot of these contactless, humanless technologies get a huge boost now, whether it's something like telemedicine, which involves not physically seeing a doctor, or, self-driving cars, for example, because basically what this National Security Commission on AI wants in terms of transportation is to eliminate individual car ownership, replace it all with fleets of self-driving cars that work as sort of an Uber-style ride-sharing network nationally. And because of the coronavirus crisis in California, for example, the DMV in California rushed through approval for 2 different self-driving car companies that are now on California roads. And there's also been a lot of positive PR for self-driving cars bringing supplies to people. And oh, look, it brought medical supplies to this little old lady. And oh, look, it brought groceries to this family and things like that, right? And what's interesting, a quote I found really interesting, was from one of the CEOs of these self-driving car companies. And he said, coronavirus has shown us that humans are biohazards and machines are not. And I think this type of mentality is going to become much more heavily promoted as time goes on to facilitate the replacement of a lot of jobs formerly performed by Americans with machines or with technology that does not require a human operator. So the fact that we're seeing this push for a universal basic income, that we're seeing record numbers of unemployment, I would argue that a lot of this is intentional. Because of this crisis, this type of technology that results in massive job loss can be introduced, but they're not blaming technocrats for imposing this on American society. They can blame the virus, right? And I think it's very interesting that if you look on this private sector task force that's advising Trump about when and how to reopen the economy, they're called the Great American Economic Revival Industry Groups. They have, a different group for each industry. And basically, if you look there, it's all billionaires. All of Trump's top billionaire donors, Sheldon Adelson and Bernard Marcus, are there. The richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, is there. All the big Silicon Valley tech companies that are also on this National Security Commission on AI, like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Apple, they are all represented. Even some members of this commission, like Safra Katz, she's also on these, industry groups advising about the economy. And a lot of these people, including Jeff Bezos, for example, he's openly talked about for years replacing human Amazon warehouse workers with machines. So I definitely think that it's disconcerting that we're seeing that type of overlap, because those types of individuals are very unlikely to be concerned about the well-being of regular Americans and are more interested and introducing, robots into the workforce because they don't have to pay robots, and they don't have to pay robots health insurance, and they don't have to pay for any of that stuff. What we saw in the 1980s was the shift of industry overseas because the labor pool was cheaper, because, labor in China or Bangladesh is much cheaper than paying an American worker to do the same task. But if you have a machine do that task, you don't have to pay them anything. You just have to pay the upfront cost for the machine and maybe some for maintenance. And I think that is unfortunately a lot of what we're going to see come to fruition, and what we're seeing now, because people are not really real. A lot of people are still in this fear-based mode of thinking, are afraid of if they're getting their news from mainstream media anyway, are looking at this from a fear-based perspective and not really critically thinking about a lot of these changes, and are just sort of assuming that the government is working in our best interest. And historically, that is not the case. And as I pointed out, a lot of these so-called quote-unquote solutions to coronavirus that we're seeing rolled out right now were planned out last year, including what I mentioned with this National Security Commission on AI, but there's many more examples. For example, the CARES Act, which is supposed to be this coronavirus quote-unquote relief bill, was actually introduced last January under a different name. And the mention of coronavirus was just inserted, and then it was passed as this relief bill. It's very similar, I would argue, to the Patriot Act, which was ready long before 9/11, but of course, after 9/11, gets rushed through with little to no debate. It's very interesting that the CARES Act, for example, has requirements or makes things law that don't have anything to do with coronavirus. As an example, the Federal Reserve meetings are all secret now, and they are now exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. That doesn't have anything to do with fighting a virus, right? I mean, it's the Federal Reserve. So it's just honestly very disconcerting, I would argue. Another example that I would like to point out as well is that recently we've seen the Department of Justice Attorney General William Barr ask for the right to indefinitely detain Americans because of coronavirus. He was actually looking for this same power last October, under the guise of fighting mass shootings before they happen, like preventing mass shootings before they happen by indefinitely detaining someone who might commit a mass shooting. And now that mass shootings are no longer scaring Americans, but coronavirus is, in my opinion, he has just moved the justification for that policy to what Americans are currently most afraid of. But the solution is the same.
Yeah, that's all scary stuff. And again, the trends are all there, and I think people should take note and prepare for the road ahead, because it's not going to be easy. A lot of jobs, it's going to be hard to make a living, and I don't want to personally be dependent on government money, and universal
me neither.
basic income. So we're pretty much running out of time. I just have a few easy questions. That was everything we covered. Is kind of the meat of the interview. If you can just give us very brief answers, just your thoughts on the China war narrative. Do you feel that we'll go to war with China and have a World War III, or you think that's just the narrative? That narrative is just being used for pushing it through this agenda.
Well, I think there's a couple possibilities there. I mean, if you look at what the Pentagon has been saying for the past couple of years, or at least Pentagon officials, they've been saying that China is our number one threat. There's pretty good documentaries out there like The Coming War on China by John Pilger that talk about the buildup of military bases surrounding China, some of these bases on the Marshall Islands and things like that are, targeted, he argues, targeted at China, and things like that. I mean, it definitely is possible, but of course, I would argue that the elite in China and the elite in the U.S. Get along a lot better than we think they do. And I think to a large extent what's going on right now with the finger pointing with, the U.S. blaming China exclusively for coronavirus and China actually blaming the U.S., saying that they brought coronavirus to China at the Wuhan military games and things of that nature. What that is designed to do, in my opinion, at least that aspect of the narrative, though it certainly could escalate, that has to do with distracting the populations of both countries from what their governments are doing to them at home. So, for example, in the U.S., if everyone is focused on how bad China is and blaming China all the time and demanding reparations for China for this and that, they're not focusing on what their government is implementing, that's screwing them over at the same time, right? I mean, if you look at all this bailout money that was supposed to bail out the economy and the American people, it was given to a giant hedge fund, BlackRock, to throw around, and none of it's gone to actual medium or small-sized businesses. It's just been a total free-for-all. Americans should honestly be outraged about that, but so many people right now are, focusing on China and blaming China for all of this. But, that type of policy, that bailout policy, was not imposed on the U.S. by China. This push towards artificial intelligence-driven economic systems and ways of life was planned last year, and it was not China that made us do it. This is something that is coming from the top down, and I think, the same thing is true in China. If they're all focused on how bad the U.S. is and, look what the U.S. is doing, they're not focusing on what their own government is doing to them, right? I mean, it's just all very convenient, and I think to a large extent, a lot of the real power in the world is not at the national level. It's supranational, and that a lot of the elite of the world don't really have any loyalties to individual countries. They have loyalties to themselves and their elite status, which they want to maintain. And the way to maintain that in a world system that is currently unsustainable is to consolidate control by whatever means necessary.